Hello.
Good morning. How are you?
All right. How are you?
Good.
Good. All right. Not sure anyone. I don't know if Jesse's going to be here. I didn't see any link to the Notion, so I
Oh,
don't
yeah,
know.
you're right.
Yeah. So how have you been doing?
I've been doing pretty well. Um, I guess I complained about this at our last meeting, but I've been using Adobe Illustrator for work, and I've enjoyed learning how to use it, but it's given me like awful screen fatigue.
Oh yeah.
Like my eyes were tired at the end of the work week, and that hasn't happened for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise good.
Yeah. That's great.
How are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. I'm teaching a couple of courses this semester, so I've got, you know, at least one of them I've taught before, so I just have the everything worked out pretty much, but the other one is a little challenging. But
What are they?
it's a project management one, and then there's something called Programming for Information Problems, which is
Hmm.
a programming course. But you have to learn how to, or you have to teach them how to write code, but also read code,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. So it's getting the lessons in place is not always. It's gone with a couple of hitches, let's just say. But
And then the project management, that's the one that you've shared
oh
with.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's and once you have that down, it's just modifying it
Right.
as you present. So this past summer, I had to modify it for like a shorter period. So it was like instead of 16 weeks, it was 8 weeks.
Oh yeah,
But it actually worked out that it got most of the information in there. So
that's good. Yeah, some classes I feel like you really can just squeeze it down and not change much, but then some that would be like way too much. Like when I taught philosophy over a couple summers, and if I had tried to do like 2 subjects a week instead of one, that would have been too much.
right, yeah,
um, but then you still want the students to like get the full class.
right,
So yeah, summer classes are hard.
yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I don't know if Jesse's going to be here, or who else is going to be here, but so you were pretty excited about a paper that was in the Slack. It was on what was it? Let's see if I can find it. It was in the Cognition Future Slack. It was the interacting spiral wave patterns underlie complex brain dynamics.
Oh yeah, I haven't read it yet, but um, that does look really cool. I'm curious what I'll pull it up right now. What like measures they use. Um,
Yeah, I could go through that and give some other things about it. Let me see if I can share my screen. So I've got it set up in here.
okay, so it's fMRI.
Okay. I think this is it. Yes, okay. So this is nature human behavior. This is, I guess, a group of Chinese people from University of Sydney in China. And this is, so yeah, it's fMRI. Yeah, there we go. And they're looking at spiral waves. Yeah, we'll go through this and then I'll give a little bit more context, at least how I see where this is coming from. So yeah, this is they're looking at large-scale activity of the human brain. They're interested in the spatiotemporal dynamics of patterns. So like the idea is that the brain exhibits rich and complex patterns as opposed to like areas of regions of interest. The spatiotemporal dynamics of these and their functional roles in cognition remain unclear. By characterizing moment by moment fluctuations of human cortical functional magnetic resonance imaging signals. So you have fMRI signals, which aren't, electrical activity, they're bold activity, so it's oxygenation. But still, you can pick up these moment by moment fluctuations, and I guess they've accounted for artifact and everything. So it's not that you're picking up some fluctuation in bold activity; you're picking up the fluctuation in brain activity, and which you might be able to also confirm with like EEG or something like that. Although it's a good question as to like if you can make that connection. But that's that's the problem with a lot of the dynamical systems approaches, is that if you have data like that, is something really like a fluctuation, or is it a signal, or is it, because you have these stochastic components to any measure that you have, and then you have the actual signal, and the signal itself then has these sort of, stochastic events, which are just chance events, chance fluctuations. Sometimes those fluctuations are just kind of randomly distributed, and sometimes there may be the consequence of cognition. So like in Wednesday's meeting, we talked about like, how you might go about characterizing cognition at different time scales. We talked about like just measuring like a trial in fMRI or something like that, or EEG, and you get a signal, you might get a component or something at about a couple hundred milliseconds in duration. And then if you think about like cognition, though, you don't just do like one trial and then another trial and another trial. You have this sort of naturalistic behavior. And so that naturalistic behavior, you're doing like your brain activity is, running over and over and over, and you get these fluctuations that resemble sort of things that get accumulated, things that come and go during cognition, things like that. So these fluctuations can be the product of those kind of processes, but also things like stochastic fluctuations that have nothing to do with cognition. It's just, a nature of the system. We show that spiral-like rotational wave patterns, or brain spirals, that sounds like a disease, are widespread during both resting and cognitive task states. So again, they're doing resting state, they're doing cognitive task state. So it's like resting state has always been problematic because it's not necessarily resting. The brain is moving. The brain is always like kind of idling, and as such, it does have activity. But anyways, if you contrast it with a cognitive state, that's, so you would see these in both of these conditions. These brain spirals propagate across the cortex while rotating around their phase singularity centers, which is interesting. I guess they're going to define what that is.
Yeah, I wonder what that means.
Giving rise to spatiotemporal activity dynamics with non-stationary features, which means that it doesn't have a sort of a characteristic period. It's just this non-stationary signal. And so this is where you get these fluctuations. The property of these brain spirals, such as their rotational directions and locations, are task relevant and can be used to classify different cognitive tasks. So these brain spirals are almost like, I don't want to say they're like regions of interest, but they do have like, if you were to like map out a brain network for like attention or for memory or for some decision making, you'd often define a number of regions of interest that are tied together into a network. And what they're arguing is that these brain spirals maybe serve something like this, where you have rotation, directions, and locations, and those kind of take the place of a network or take the place of like a set of regions of interest. So that's, we'll see. We also demonstrate that multiple interacting brain spirals are involved in coordinating the correlated activations and deactivations of distributed functional regions. So that must I guess what they're saying is that it's almost like one of those regions of interest that you would find in a brain network. So if you had in a regular brain network, we might have like a regular brain here. I'll just use a human brain as an example. And, I don't know, let's draw a structure here. And then, you'll have your regions of interest, which are the areas that, actually, that's not it. The areas of interest, which are these defined kind of like this. And they're just areas like maybe architectonic areas or groups of neurons or, neuronal tissue, I should say, that work together. What they're saying is that in a brain, that's a better one, that you have these brain spirals that are kind of these regions where you get these dynamical systems or these maybe dynamical subsystems that work together. So there's a correlation between these areas. And, I'll bring up later that there has been a lot of literature on different oscillators and like Kuramoto oscillators, which are these oscillators that they're synchronized oscillators. So if you think about like fireflies, you have these synchronized oscillators. And if they have a signal that entrains them, which is usually like an environmental signal, like light or chemicals or something, they can all flash together. But if they're not synchronized and they don't flash in unison and they flash independently. And so there's been a lot of work on that sort of model. Kuramoto oscillators and fireflies, but also in the brain as excitable systems. So like neurons are excitable cells. They use that sort of excitation as a sort of a metaphor at the level of like whole brain networks. And you can look at the correlations between these oscillators and you can get synchronization, you can get desynchronization. So you draw a network around these different points and it tells you something about the connectedness of the system and so forth. Oops. So yeah, that's what they're getting at. Like these brain spirals are sort of nodes in a network almost.
One thing that's interesting is just like looking at the picture that was the thumbnail with the rainbow.
Yeah.
There's like a continuity in the phases. Like the phases vary smoothly. If I'm understanding that right.
Yeah, they're not discontinuous. They're yeah.
Which I guess it would be more surprising if they were discontinuous, but
right. Yeah, I don't know if that's an artifact of well, they probably smooth the data to find because there's a lot of noise in the data generally speaking, but this is where there actually are in dynamical systems, people look at discontinuities, like something like the Hough bifurcation where there's a discontinuity in the phase of something. But this is where you have this continuity, around a central point. Well, we'll have to get into why that is as we get into the paper. Let's see. This mechanism enables flexible configuration of task-driven activity flow between bottom-up and top-down directions during cognitive processing. So they talk about activity flow, which I think is interesting because it's, not, they're thinking about this in a continuous way. So it's not like these areas are active in one trial or one condition and deactivated in another condition. It's that there's this temporal aspect and there's this activity flow. And the flow actually, is like any other flow. It can be impeded, it can be facilitated, and so forth. Then between bottom-up and top-down directions during cognitive processing. Our findings suggest that the brain spirals organize complex spatiotemporal dynamics of the human brain and have functional correlates to cognitive processing. So this is really not like cognitive processing per se, but they're identifying these things in these conditions if you're, measuring behavior. And your cognitive processing, I guess, is defined as like if I have a very constructed task, which is usually what we do in experiments. We construct a task that isn't necessarily something we do in the real world. It's something we do in a magnet or, when we're measuring the brain. Something very simple, but also something that will engage these areas. And so we can't say that, like, if we can't say exactly what cognitive processing is. Really, a lot of that is a hypothesis, but this is basically the correlate here, where if we're doing something, we see something in the brain, it's the correlate, and hopefully it's reproducible. So actually they talk about networks here. Advances in large-scale recordings of the human brain have revealed multiple functional networks, such as the somatomotor and attention networks and the default mode network. This is where you have just, somatomotor involves movement, generating movement, interpreting movement. Attention network, of course, is where, you're paying attention to things. You have this attentional fixation on things, and you shift that attention accordingly. And then default mode, which is where you're just kind of staring off into space and thinking, or maybe resting your mind, which of course isn't necessarily as resting your mind. But that's, so we have these functional networks. We have them, they're sort of organized along a gradient extending from unimodal, like auditory networks, to transmodal, which would be default mode. And that means that they use different sensory modalities. So the auditory network is just audition. Transmodal meaning like it involves audition and vision and all this. So we know that there are differences there. And so then we need to kind of think about some of the properties. If we measure it with something like fMRI or EEG, we need to think of the properties of the measurement regime. So these large-scale organizational properties have conventionally been characterized by temporal correlations of slow fluctuations of fMRI signals averaged over the course of an entire session. So again, these fluctuations, they're slow fluctuations in the signal, and they average those, and that's how they usually get an account of the bold signal. Usually in papers, you'll see like a bar graph where they'll have something like maybe a experimental condition, a control condition. So you have something like this with error bars, of course. This would be the control, this would be the experiment. And so that doesn't tell you a lot about cognition, really. This is the bold signal, and then this is the condition. So it doesn't tell you a whole lot about cognition, except that if I took some a set of trials and I averaged over it, and then I averaged my signal or some component of the signal, there's a significant difference, and that's pretty much it. And that doesn't tell you a lot about cognition. But in as it turns out, a lot of what we get from brain imaging data or from something like electric physiological data has multiple components at multiple time scales. So you get different types of noise and fluctuations, different types of signals that you can use. And so then how do you represent that? You could average over for the different components, but that doesn't tell you a lot either, because it's just kind of a number that you're kind of washing out a lot of the variability. So that's, this is stuff that people have thought about a lot, but so this is figure 1 here. This is exactly the figure that we were just talking about with these spiral-like rotational wave patterns and their interactions. So A is clockwise and B is anti-clockwise. So this, or wait a minute, this is, no. A here at the top is, left is clockwise, so it's going in this direction. And then B, this on the right side of A is anti-clockwise, which is this. And so you can see there's a phase angle here where, they're different. They have it color coded, so it's negative pi to pi. And that just describes the phase of like a sine wave. So like if you have a sine wave, instead of like averaging and getting a bar graph, you'll have a sine wave. And we always model time series and dynamical systems with a sine wave because there's this fluctuation over time. So this is time. And it's some deviation from the sine wave, but the phase is usually like either like, from this point to this point. So there are all sorts of angles so each part of this curve is a tangent, and the tangent sits in a certain direction. And so you can think about this as a circle. That's why we use pi. And then it's at some angle from the center. And so each of these components have a different angle coming out. And so you just take those components at that angle and you say, what is it about this part of the signal? It's going in a certain direction from that point. So we can actually, if we have a sine wave, it's actually pretty easy. When we have a non-stationary signal, which is something that doesn't have a clear period, maybe something like this, then it's a little harder. But we can still use this method to kind of measure what's going on. So that's what they're doing here, and they're smoothing out the data and getting these results. As detailed in the results, these spirals are characterized by their phase fields, color map, this color map here, and the corresponding phase vector fields, phase gradient velocity field denoted by the white arrows, which are these. So basically you have this phase angle and then this gradient that is showing up here. And again, it looks pretty neat, nice and neat, but this is probably, I don't exactly know why it's, this is just the characterization of it. It's not.
Yeah, I was trying to read the methods, and they use like classifying algorithms. So there's a few layers between the raw data and this picture, obviously, but I don't understand all of the layers.
Yeah, they do a lot of processing of the data. So yeah, and then this is B here, down here is pairs of brain spirals with the opposite left. So this is where you have, it's like cogs, two cogs coming together. One's going rightward, one's going leftward. They're kind of moving. Looks like they're, like the right one is driving the left one, if you think of them as two cogs. And then the one on the right here is where they're both going in the same direction. So they're synchronized in terms of their direction. So that's actually, I don't think one is driving the other, they're just kind of synchronized. So parts of brain spirals with the opposite left and the same rotational directions right. The blue and red circles represent the spirals of clockwise and anti-clockwise rotating directions, respectively. So they have these rotation directions. A lot of like dynamical systems can be stated as like, things that happen in a circular mode or things that happen in sort of a phase of a sine wave. So, if you think about those two things, like if this thing is going around in a circle, how can I, usually it's like synchronizing two things. It's like if they're going in the same direction versus opposite directions, or if they're, if there's a position in the orbit that's, synchronized versus not. That's usually a way to think about it. The red and blue circles represent the spirals of clockwise and anti-clockwise rotating directions. The white solid arrows represent spiral rotation directions. The black dotted lines with arrows illustrate how activity flows around the spiral pairs. So this is where activity is flowing. So this is kind of like where you have two cogs that mesh together, and this is where they're independent but they're synchronized. And so this is just kind of a way to think about these rotational patterns and how they interact. So I assume that these two are going to be different brain regions, for example. And so like if you had two brain regions in our network, we go back to our brain network, we can see that, we have these connections between brain regions. If each one of these brain regions is a spiral, then, they're either going in the same direction, so they're kind of entrained, or they're going in opposite directions, which means that they're maybe anti-correlated, or that one is maybe driving the other one in the other direction. There's a lot of stuff in the brain where things get inhibited and disinhibited. So that could be part of it too, where you get these signals that drive the downstream center in the opposite direction. So there are a lot of things you could do with this. And so, so then they actually elucidate this by analyzing a set of naturalistic language task data. So this is where they're looking at like storytelling, math message listening, question and answering task sessions. So they're using verbal data, or they're using verbal stimuli to drive these brain spirals. Our findings indicate that the location and rotation directions of brain spirals can be used to classify different task conditions, including their potential functional correlation. The simultaneous rotation of multiple brain spirals collectively coordinates the correlated activations and deactivations of distributed functional regions. So this is what we were talking about with these rotation directions and these different centers that kind of mimic, or at least they kind of draw out the components of a brain network, which ones are affecting another one. This is a sort of an open question in brain networks, is, what's the causality? So if I just get a bunch of correlations and I say, here's my brain network, I can't say which area is causing activity in which area. I mean, there are ways you can do this. We talked about Granger causality, where you have a time lag between two time series and you try to predict the activity of this center versus the activity of this center by looking at its, like, this is time series A, this is time series B. And then you say, what is the effect of A on B? So you lag B and you say, what is the prior activity of A or the prior activity of B and the activity of A lagged, how does that predict B? So it's like the idea is that you have this activity that moves from A to B. It takes a certain amount of time to get there to have an effect on B. Does that show up in the time series for B? But there are other ways to do that, and especially if you had these kind of spiral waves where they were either entrained or they were moving in another direction, or maybe the less nice and neat answer, which is that they have a little bit of fluctuation in their phase. In other words, that this one moves in one direction, this one moves back and forth, maybe a little bit, or it's unstable. That might be indicative of, what areas are affecting what other areas. So yeah, this is a nice paper. They kind of get into some of this where, they just kind of get into these different regions. So this is how we usually characterize brain regions, and they're kind of mapping those to these spirals. You're going to say something?
Well, I'm just thinking it's interesting, or it would be interesting if you could describe features of the brain networks using like the laws of physics that can describe turbulence. Just like looking at those patterns. I know it's describing something more abstract than like molecules. But looking at those patterns, it looks like, the flow of a molecule through like the flow of a fluid. Um, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit, where this kind of where some of these ideas might come from. So yeah, they do a lot of interesting stuff here. Again, they're characterizing these as like these components of direction from a central point. So you get this sort of, and this is characterizing a sine wave as like the model for the dynamical system. So like you're going in a certain direction, and it's the phase from the of the signal. So this is where you get these different phase locations. They're measured in radians because they're around a circle. And so these are the dynamical properties of brain spirals. So there's this A are just different snapshots of representative brain spiral showing variable angular speed as a function of time. So we're looking at the angular speed, which is where it's moving in a certain direction as a function of time over time. And yeah, the spiral's instantaneous angular speeds, which is omega, are calculated between neighboring time steps. This is a zoomed in view here. That's of sample phase singularity trajectories in the PCC, which is a region of the brain. So this is a trajectory here that goes across the space, and then these are these trajectories within that region. So you can see that they can measure, like with resolution, you can measure different parts in their different trajectories throughout that region. So even within a brain region, you have different trajectories. And so you're able to take these regions of interest and break them down into parts where you can identify these spirals. It's interesting that they seem to overlap a lot in some places. So you're getting like interactions between the spirals themselves. So actually that picture where we had the circles and they were interacting, that doesn't necessarily have to be between regions of the brain network. That can be within a region. And of course, these each of these little regions within the, I guess this is the PCC, or this is I guess it's the PCC. I don't know. This says PCC and IPC, and then it shows the whole thing. Maybe it's both of them there. But this is where you get these overlapping signals. So I don't know how they partition this, but it's kind of interesting to see that they have these spirals kind of interacting, and there's a lot of heterogeneity within a certain region. So that's great. And then I'm not going to get too much into the methods. I think Amanda talked about how there are a lot of layers of processing with the data. So that's always an issue. Whether you're kind of gaming the data for what you want to get out of it or not. But
right, I don't know enough about fMRI to know what they're talking about and to know exactly what assumptions go into it.
Yeah. So here, I guess in this graph, they show the normalized frequency or probability of population average spiral-spiral interactions among three common types. So they basically, in this one, they kind of show these different types. It looks like they can be separate or they come together and interact. And they have these fields that surround, these gradients that surround the spiral. So these are the gradients versus the spiral itself. And the idea would be kind of like, it's almost like a weather map where you get two low pressure systems or two high pressure systems, and they kind of come into contact. Except in this case, I think they come together in different ways. So they actually define three common types of interaction: the full annihilation, the partial annihilation, and the repulsion. So I assume that means that they either repel from one another, they kind of come together and cancel each other out, or they only do that partially. So it looks like this one is coming together and then it disappears. These, by contrast, kind of get repulsed away from one another, and maybe there's some annihilation in here as well. But that's basically what they're looking at. They have these, these gradients around the spiral. Then they interact in certain ways. The gradient may push it away or it may pull it together, and then they can annihilate one another. And it's kind of interesting stuff, the way what they think about this, and they can do a lot of really interesting things with dynamical systems. It's sometimes it looks like it's made up, but like you can do some really interesting things with the data. And then this just talks about brain spirals being task specific during cognitive processing, and this shows kind of for different tasks. This is story listening, math listening, and contrast, and they just show their differences here. There's a spiral density map. This is in the left hemisphere, and so for the first column, it's the story listening task. For the second column, it's the math listening task. And then for the third column, it's, not sure. Anyways, the point is that there are differences here in these maps, but you can also characterize that then through a vortex count. So I said that, you can use an average of the bold signal and produce a bar chart with error bars. In this case, they're using vortex count as a percent, and then they're reproducing that sort of bar chart representation. But, that's at some point you have to do that to show significance. And so that's how they're doing that. Yeah, I think that's probably it for this paper, or at least the main paper. Do you have any more comments on it before I move on to?
There's this video of David Lynch talking about meditation or something, and he says, like, inside you there's an ocean of consciousness. And then looking at those little spiral maps, I was thinking, inside you there are whirlpools of consciousness. That's interesting, and it's interesting that it looks like like a fluid, like Jesse said, like a weather map. And there are these little whirlpools that interact.
Yeah. So there's a lot of background in dynamical systems for these kind of approaches, but I wanted to point out a few that might be kind of interesting, sort of aside sort of ideas. So the first one is this. So this is a paper from 2007. And this is called Covariant String-like Dynamics of Scroll Wave Filaments in Anisotropic Cardiac Tissue. So it's physical review letter, so of course it's a very inaccessible title. And, so it has been hypothesized that stationary scroll wave filaments in cardiac tissue describe a geodesic incurved space, which means it's just like this sort of geometric representation of what's going on in cardiac tissue. So you have these scroll wave filaments in cardiac tissue, which is muscle. That means that you can measure this sort of excitable signal. Like you have neurons that are firing and they have this excitable signal and they produce this output that we can measure. In muscle, it does a similar thing. You get activity in muscle because in heart muscle, it has to pump blood, so there are multiple sort of oscillations there. And so you can characterize that as a stationary scroll wave. And a scroll wave is like a wave that is sort of curled up and then unleashes. So it's kind of like if you have a three-dimensional, it's like a wave kind of, it's a wave that moves from one place to another, but it scrolls up and then it unscrolls. So it's like just a way that this, again, this movement metaphor. So it's not like we're thinking about it in terms of like the displacement or something. We're thinking about this as terms of a wave. A geodesic incurved space whose metric is the inverse diffusion tensor. Several numerical studies support this hypothesis, but no analytical proof has been provided yet for general anisotropy. Anisotropy just means like there's variation across the space. So would be like the same thing as what we saw with that example from that brain region where you had those oscillators that were going in different orientations. It's just heterogeneity. In this letter, we derived dynamic equations for the filament in the case of general anisotropy. These equations are covariant under general spatial coordinate transformations and describe the motion of a string-like object in a curved space, whose metric tensor is the inverse diffusion tensor. So the behavior of squirrel wave filaments in excitable media, which is this heart muscle, with anisotropy, which means it's variable across space and across time, I guess, too, is similar to one of the cosmic strings in a curved universe. So they use this mathematics from a different place to describe this. And so they talk about scroll waves here. Scroll waves in excitable media are an important example of three-dimensional self-organization. They have been observed in a wide range of systems, including the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. And the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction is it's like a self-assembling reaction where you put some chemicals together in a medium and they start to form these circles and spirals in the chemical soup. So like you just set up a chemical reaction and it produces these patterns. It's an interesting experiment, an interesting reaction that describe, you can see like the self-organization of activity. Then we can also look at Dictyostelium discoideum, which is the slime mold. They again can form patterns with their collective behavior of the slime mold cells. And then of course cardiac tissue, which is muscle that is producing a sort of a rhythmic output around a pacemaker. And so it's got this property as well. In the latter, scroll waves of electrical excitation have been associated with cardiac arrhythmias and ventricular fibrillation. So this is where they're going with this. They describe this sort of movement as scroll waves, and so that's really interesting stuff. Now this actually is a little bit deeper, has a little bit deeper history in physics and biological physics, and this is someone called Arthur Winfrey, and he published on this throughout his career. So he published a book in 1980. It's called The Geometry of Biological Time. And so in this book, he kind of merged topology and temporal phenomena into one model. And he was looking at different parts of the body, like the heart and things like that. So this is persistent tangles of vortex rings in excitable media. So he talks about vortex filaments in excitable media, and there are numerous examples, form stable organizing centers. So this is like self-organization, but centers for self-organization. Compact, spatially symmetric, temporally periodic configurations of linked and knotted rings, emitting a scroll-shaped wave train, or scroll-shaped wave trains, while slowly moving through the medium. So the medium would be like, a group of cells or a tissue in this case, and it's moving through there as a excitable signal. So it would be like activation of, I guess with the bold signal, it's a little bit different, but basically we're supposed to think that the neurons are being excited in a pattern that it produces a wave. So it's going through a bunch of neurons one after the other instead of just random activity. And so you get these waves and you get these spirals and things like that. All past examples use excitable media in which the two-dimensional spiral wave, which is X and Y, pivots rigidly without meander. So remember I said he was a topologist as well, so he's interested in more than 2 dimensions. He's interested in 3 dimensions where you have a tissue volume instead of a box where you look down on it. So this is something that, you can see the wave not just propagating across the surface, but down into the tissue as well. Vortex filaments in such special media remain motionless when uncurved and free of twist. Are these conditions essential for persistence of vortex rings against collapse and reversion? to a spatial uniform steady state? That's a question he's asking, which means, is this are these rings sort of do they maintain self-organization, or do we end up back in a state where there's no self-organization and it's pretty much just a steady state that's uniform? So that's what he's asking. So does this persist? And in this paper, he shows by example that even if all variables diffuse equally in this case, or if the two-dimensional vortex meanders spontaneously, the usual case, so there's that noise again, that stochasticity, compact organizing centers of topologically distinct kinds can still persist. So that means that your organizing centers are persistent over time, and that this has a number of ways of happening. These persistent organizing centers are not stable. They continually change shape without ever repeating. So this means that they're not stable, but they're sort of persistent. But their persistence for 70 rotation periods or more under generic conditions, a numerical experiment suggests that they should be observable in nature. So yeah, Art Winfrey has a lot of work on this. It's classic work, I guess you could say. And this last paper I want to talk about here, actually this is a chapter out of that book that I told you about, The Geometry of Biological Time. This is chapter 9, which is excitable kinetics and excitable media. And so this goes into some of this. So in chapter 3, it talks about ring devices. In chapter 4, it talks about populations and communities of single variable units, like simple clocks and an hourglass. So this is a cool book because he comes up with all these like cool ideas about measuring time and geometry and then linking it to biology. I've always loved this book. And so he talks about some of these oscillators, and then he says, what about non-oscillatory kinetics with more than one variable? So then he talks about that. He gets into excitability, clocks and hourglasses. This is 2 ways of attracting cycle to change for an attracting cycle to change locally, resulting in excitable kinetics without spontaneous oscillation. So you have these oscillators that change. These arrows just mean that that's the orbit that the system is taking. You take a parameter of its movement or of its oscillation. You take a phase, you can calculate the phase, or you can calculate sort of an order parameter, and you can get these orbits. And you're plotting this against like the phase angle and time, or 2 phase angles, different points in time, and you're getting these kind of patterns. So that's what you're getting here. It's like an attractor basin, but actually it's not an attractor basin because you get these stable points and you get this rotation around that point. And so it's not quite the same thing. This is an excitable oscillator at the bottom, so that's why we have this sort of things are moving inward towards the oscillator, but the oscillator is also moving outward. So you get this stability. And in this case, you don't have that. It's just kind of a random spontaneous oscillation. And so it talks about excitable media and how we think of neurons and muscles, excitable media. Excitable media that's maybe inorganic or non-biological are things like explosive chemical reactions, or other types of things where you get this excitation of energy. In in the nervous system, we have neurons, we have muscle, and they have an action potential or something where it's generating some sort of electrical potential. So you have these we call them excitable because they have a state change in their output. And so people have done this, they've done a lot of modeling of excitable systems. Like I said, the Kuramoto oscillator is a good example because it's a network of oscillators that can synchronize with their excitable activity. We have other types of models here. And yeah, so then, you want to map that to topology. So you have things where, this is where you get these graphical models, and, kind of goes through some of that. It's got a lot of nice pictures in the book too. That's another thing that's really good about it. This is an example of the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. If you have this reaction, you tend to see these type of patterns, which are these interrupted rings. So they kind of they kind of form these patterns that propagate and form these kind of spiral arcs. So this is where you get this pattern formation in a chemical reaction. And then, you get these really pretty pictures where you get these waves that kind of spiral out. So this is a scroll wave. This is where it's kind of looks like a screw coming out. So it's three-dimensional. It's not two-dimensional. So it kind of comes up in time, but it kind of moves outward. So you have 3 dimensions. And so I think that's all I'll talk about with that. I just wanted to show like kind of that paper and then talk about maybe some of the origins of it and what people were thinking. And then the application back to the brain, it's interesting. If you have different types of data sets, what is that? How do we map those data sets onto these kind of mathematical and conceptual models? Okay. Jesse said, I'll be unable to speak much for a bit more. That's what I thought of some weather maps. Yeah, the weather map thing he talked about. Fronts, high, low pressure centers, etc. Yeah. And then Amanda said, while spiral waves rotate around cores, scroll waves rotate around filaments, which can not only move in space but also change shape. This is what we were talking about with the first paper. And yeah, so spiral waves and scroll waves are different. They make a distinction. One rotate around cores, the other rotate around filaments, which can not only move in space but also change shape. So the filaments can be sort of mutable in terms of shape. Okay, we have any other questions about that or comments?
No, but that was all very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I don't know if Jesse can talk, if he wants to give an update or.
Hey, yes, I can now. I'm in the midst of dealing with. I was trying to be fancy and like pre-arrange some things for like breakfast here, and it's a complete mess. I just wrote listing a list of questions. The event's a couple weeks away, and topics from open source, AI ethics, IP, intellectual property, law, technology, development, gender and so on. Actually, I just met someone who works in patent law, in like the Boston area. Well, I think they're a law-ish student in Boston, so I might try to follow up with them too about it. I wonder if they're going to the event. I didn't actually say they're going to this event or not. But there's just a lot of stuff that'd be really cool. We had a really nice discussion about things. One second. And it's been on my mind a lot since then. So that was really good. Okay, that's ahead. Which creation features was also very good, and I don't know. I guess you guys didn't talk much about that. It's funny because you two were both there, but to kind of speak to like the audience or the rest of the group, or to commemorate it a bit. That's something where I did put together a few notes and actually put in the Condition Features channel. I made I just took a screenshot of some notes I made. I typed very, very, very quickly with a bunch of typos. Those are the rough notes I did right at the meeting, and a lot of interesting things there from Cardiff. Like it's sort of tracing this. I kind of want to make this would be good to do. Make it a little diagram, kind of tracing phenomenology as we've been using it. Because as I mentioned, I think during the meeting, like the whole critical theory stuff and how like critical theory is an approach, but also sort of a lineage, like capital C critical theory and maybe in this style of critical theory, approach. And phenomenology, even originally, was potentially mentioned as a critical theory in sort of like a literature or like movement sense, like Merleau-Ponty and Herschel and that kind of zone of it, and going up from that kind of, I don't know what to call that. This I may have a good philosophical term for it, like like phenomenology as a, I don't really know if it's more of a philosophical or kind of a, it's not really. Oh, I remember I have to talk about the the lecture I went to. I'll talk about that later. I attended I was able to get into a talk held at Harvard. But this one, I'm talking about phenomenology here right now, and I mean that kind of tracing its origins, and I don't really know how to describe its origins very well, as like why phenomenology emerged as a critical theory. You could say, like you said, there's things, the elements that go way all the way back to earlier stuff, but I don't really know how to speak well about those differences and that sort of lineage. Because what I'm trying to get in the modern sense is like, okay, you have like Herschel, you have Merleau-Ponty, you have this, what is this where things started to get interesting? I remember that quote from like Shimero. Many other people say this is where things start to get interesting, because you're taking the like neuroscience, you're taking a little bit of philosophy, you're taking these sort of these different things coming together. But then you get, then you get like, it's like the pre-Varela, I think would be a way to say it, the pre-Varela stuff, and then Varela comes in, and we explored recently the dovetail between cybernetics. Cybernetics comes into play. We get to second and or third order cybernetics and the biological influence, and sort of tracing the line of cybernetics bridges off into different parts of AI, et cetera, et cetera. And then Varela comes in and starts on this path towards what will become neurophenomenology, with on becoming aware. And we've read this book about this. How do we try to start more rigorously mapping out this process? Then we looked at the gesture of awareness, as it was described by other people, or like the Varela lineage continued. And now we're at this place with Depraz, Natalie Depraz, who's with Varela on some of those other works, and looking at cardiophenomenology. And that's basically the paper we've been at, which is sort of related to potentially related to this sort of broader concept of well, maybe not broader, but this concept of microphenomenology, which is sort of individual transactions of phenomenological experience, and then like instantaneous. I don't know if this is really fair to say, and if you've read more of the paper, Amanda, feel free to like say, oh no, that's not at all what they're trying to do. But the way they're phrasing it makes it kind of sound like microphenomenology is almost like instantaneous, like instantaneous velocity-ish in terms of the relation to calculus. Like we're studying this specific finite zone, and I don't yet quite understand. Like, it looks like what we were getting at in the previous meeting was, I'll try to pull up my notes on this maybe, so it's not just me talking at the world. Like the cardiophenomenology paper was interesting because I was trying to share my screen here. It's not gonna let me do that. That's okay. I can do this though. There we go. Yeah, here we go. That kind of works. What's interesting about the cardiophenomenology stuff is that they're kind of trying to get it towards a kind of narrowing it down. Like the conclusion of the abstract is basically, oops, that's not it. Where'd it go? And the last sentence of the abstract basically says, "Oh, well, and we think it's particularly relevant to look at it like at this time scale of a second and a half to a second, or like 30, half a second. Like this they kind of demarcate this period in which cardiophenomenological input or assessment is relevant, as opposed to and a major theme. Maybe I can pull this up. Very very sloppy notes and everything, but oops, wrong one. I would just lost my train of thought a little bit. Like a big thing was kind of going from, well, you can't, a major sort of like fulcrum point in the discussion is sort of, maybe it's, I don't know, nexus of discussion is you can't feel your neurons fire. So let's look at something you can feel and subjectively relate to, which is your heartbeat. It's sort of one of the thrusts of discussion. And we've said in turn, well, how about we've challenged that a little bit in some of our thoughts and discussion, saying, is that a reasonable, like, what about headaches, or what about other pressures, what about XYZ, what about this and that, and what about
what about brain spirals?
Yeah. So and it's just been fun to trace that. I've kind of been just retracing the path from the top of my head, but I'm sure you, Amanda, or Riley want to say some things about that. So stop sharing my screen for a second.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I'll ask another question, like is it on Wednesday, or I like to ask these questions. If you can't, like, we talk about, well, we were talking about brain spirals earlier, and that's something that is a construct that we make from the data. So we actually have to analyze the data. We won't necessarily be able to feel our neurons, but we also won't be able to feel something like that. So, if there's something that's affecting us, like some collective behavior of neurons, or a certain set of neurons firing, or a network, we can't feel that, but we nevertheless feel the consequences of that. And so, we were talking about these two different streams. One is like the sort of the subcognitive, and one is the cognitive. There's a lot of stuff that's subcognitive that goes on in your brain, and there's cognitive stuff that goes on in your brain, and then there's, of course, the things you reflect on, which is maybe metacognitive, and things you can't necessarily reflect on. So you can't say, oh yeah, I want my neuron that, I remember this neuron firing and then this neuron firing. So yeah, I asked a question on Wednesday. Interfacing with basal affectivity. Is that like something you came up with, or is that?
Yes, that's not a quote. I just thought of like, just going back to Fuchsian inspired here, as I'm finishing my frustrating talk with the food I wanted to eat and the time scale of my disappointment about that. There's going to launch into like the time scale stuff too, but what you're saying is like, yeah, it's like I feel like in a Fuchsian sense we're kind of getting at this border of what are these like sensors we can put right on the boundaries. What are those things, and like for those who aren't really familiar or don't know what we're talking about, there's this time scale discussion that is inarticulately working towards commenting on was basically, rarely said often in the meetings, and we had discussions before before conditioned futures existed, even like different time scales, and cognition happening at different time scales, different sort of immediate things, different longer term stuff, different sort of inertial flows and weights and stuff that affect all these different things. And Bradley can, I'm sure, articulately say more about that. But the basal affectivity stuff I thought of just now is sort of like, yeah, like what, in terms of Thomas Fuchs's conception of things, basal affectivity is sort of getting at what is the periphery, the boundary of things that we can feel. I don't. Maybe a more accurate term would be have that which would be able to create a sense of almost like hot or cold. Like okay, there's enough of something. There's enough of ability in the signal processing sense. There's enough of an ability to interpret that there's a medium by which signal and noise can take place, or at least there's some signal can come through and be discernible in the Norbert Wiener sense of all information is impossible. It's impossible to transmit information, save for transmitting alternatives. So I think basal effectivity in this case that we're getting up here is sort of the minimalist, the barest way to get a discernible sense of yes or no, good, bad, whatever, some kind of an alternative approach that's informative at like the lowest level, and it's kind of like what's on the border of that, what's on the borderline or the periphery of the interface of that, and that seems to be related to, I don't know. I'm curious as to like when we get to like cardio phenomenology or micro phenomenologies or whatever, like that seems to be okay. What are these spaces we can get some feedback and try to get some kind of a measure from it? And I kind of interpret the cardio phenomenology paper and the effort of doing that as sort of a foray of like into that, and also explicitly in the paper they say, oh yes, we are very intentionally saying the cognitive system now is not just the brain and not is not just mental. We're saying no, like they're making a claim that to extending that it like incorporating the heart into it, the cardio-phenomenological aspect of it is like relevant. I forget if they literally substantiate that beyond like we think it's important, but I don't think the paper was sort of, I don't know. I'm curious if you guys have thoughts about that part of it too. But I guess I'm just sort of doing this winding recap of like what we've been looking at, and then sort of the phenomenological development of, I guess, the Verroelian lineage and how that relates to these other things we've been talking about. So feel free to say more as I argue at my point again.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I never got to the question. I guess I forgot what the question was, but so that actually brought up another thing, which is like, what do we sort of, why don't we report like everything that happens in cognition? Why is it just kind of almost like a summary that we give as the experience? So like we don't really say that, like I guess if we had a model of what's going on inside, we can feel our heartbeat, but we can't necessarily discern all the dynamics of the heart and heart activity. And, we might say, well, I feel something in my head. I feel something's happening in my brain. Or maybe if we have a more sophisticated mental model, we say, I can feel the neurons firing, which isn't necessarily a feeling, but you'd say like what you think is happening. So, but why don't we like have this method of reporting every kind of thing, or being able to report what's going on in our bodies, since our bodies are producing that? Why can't we report it as an experience? So, what is it? Oh, reminder for Jesse. Talk about.
That's just for me. Yeah. That's just because I'm going to forget that. I'm sure.
Okay. So actually, I wanted to go back to my board and talk about like something I just sketched out in my notes when I was sitting here. Yeah. So.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's this. We said on Wednesday we were talking about like how we have these two levels. We have sort of the subcognitive event level, which are all these things that are happening in the brain or in the body that kind of produce behaviors or integrate information or whatever we want to say. These could be like neural activations. These could be areas communicating with one another. These could be like, hard activity dynamics. And these are maybe like dynamical events of different scales, different sizes. So they unfold over time and space, as we saw in the first part. And then we have these sort of, what we can experience, which is, of course, intertwined with behavior or outputs of behavior. So but let's just say, for example, for the sake of argument, that we have like, it could be that, we produce a behavior and we observe it and we say, okay, that's what our brain did, or that's what our heart did, or we might be able to feel something but not describe the process by which it got there. So we have these kind of points in the experience time series, and we have these points in the subcognitive time series, and it's kind of connected like this. So you have this subcognitive domain that's producing a bunch of events that are being integrated sort of in experience. You have this maybe behavioral manifestation of these subcognitive events, and then you experience. So maybe there's like another level here of behavior. So we can experience behavior, but like, it's kind of hard to interpret behavior, because there are all sorts of behaviors that are sort of like, if you watch a video of yourself, you'll notice that if you're sitting there, you often like, make little, you might touch your body or scratch your head or something. And it's something you're not really aware of while you're doing it. It's just kind of like this thing that happens that you do and you don't realize it. You blink your eyes. Those aren't things that you really kind of remember and savor. They're just kind of these things that get put out by. There's one hypothesis that this is like neural noise. That's like the noise that your nervous system makes is reproducing itself in these little ticks. Or sometimes if you stand on a pressure plate, your posture sways in ways that are sort of stochastic, that reflect like the noise at this subcognitive level. So yeah. So we can actually further tie in some of the behaviors like this. And so then we have this map of like these subcognitive events, experience, and then behaviors that can inform experience more direct, kind of we can understand maybe behavior a little bit better than single events at the neuronal level or at the muscle level or neuronal network level. And so that's kind of what I was thinking. And the question actually asked on Wednesday is, what would happen if we had an agent where they could actually perceive a lot of what was happening at the subcognitive level, like, had an account of it that they could recount. Some of this, like, there's this thing in neural networks called a credit assignment, where they try to figure out which neurons are activated when some output is made. Now, the reason that you can't do that in neural networks or it's hard in neural networks, is because there are a lot of interactions within the network, and a lot of the patterns are maybe not reproducible. So they're just kind of like these one-time things. So it's hard to recognize the pattern or find the pattern. Sometimes noise can play into it. So some of these subcognitive events are very noisy. So knowing every event doesn't really help you, because some of it is noisy, like we talked about in the first part of in the discussion on that paper. There's a lot of noise that needs to be filtered, and if you don't have the filter, then it doesn't really matter. On the other hand, your filter kind of blocks you from being able to recognize individual events. You can recognize collective outputs. Maybe if you have a seizure, that's a collective output of neuronal activity, and it's something that manifests in behavior. And then you experience a seizure, and you say, "Oh, I had a seizure." Well, I think it has something to do with the neurons in my brain. There's a behavior which is like I'm convulsing, and then that's my experience. So I mean, that's kind of the answer I had to that question and the follow-up that I had. What if you could identify that? Well, if you could identify all the subcognitive events that led to a certain behavior or a certain experience, you'd still have this problem of noise and of like the relevance of specific components.
Well,
So
and yes, and I don't want to interrupt you. So
I'm just writing this down.
If you're finishing your point.
Yeah, I'm done with my point.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't quite grasp that's what you were getting at. I'm so glad I brought this up again because I didn't quite grasp that you meant an agent itself should specifically be able to look at like that, the subcognitive stuff. I think this is amazing. Like this is so cool for me because this feels like this goes back to like my first ever. It's not the same, but it feels really it goes back to my first thing joining the lab, which is about the Bainbridge vehicles and about my original sort of thing. It's not. I don't really know if it's. I don't even know what to call it. My very unformulated idea about like cognitive toggling between different sort of things.
Oh yeah.
And it's not. It wasn't at all what this was though. But this is sort of like much more interesting version of that idea. And many of the Brayton vehicle project stuff is for those who don't know anything about it and are watching this later. It's a little strange for me because I feel like I was immersed in that for like a year and a half, and nobody in the lab outside of Bradley talks about it anymore. But it's like a permanent foundation to. I could be like, oh yeah, in our brain for vehicles we did this, and this. I didn't even do very much of that, but like conceptually and in terms of the modeling and the agent-based modeling and the meta brain stuff, that's all there for me. So what's really interesting is that the way we're bringing it up, or you're bringing it up now, in pointing it out in the diagram, which I put in. I guess I'll share that I finally made the notion space if you want to put it there. I did put a screenshot of the diagram in there, which is good. So that's all that's in there. It's just the timeline needs to be updated, so I didn't worry about that yet. But it's just there. What's cool about this iteration in the conversation now is that we're kind of getting into this, really interesting space that kind of fits like complexity, dynamical systems, and like the sort of emergent issues. And the thing is, like, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, but one of the harder things, like, and I'm a little bit familiar with like credit assignments. I don't want to. I'm hesitant to use a term here because I think I'm going to use it. It's kind of intuitive what it means, but like I feel like there's implications that I'm not going to wield properly when I'm talking about stuff. So I'm kind of going to dance around that by saying, specifically regarding noise and the different levels of subcognitive to cognitive to like overt behavior, and also as a huge like nudge wink wink. Yeah, we don't, because we don't really have a lot of ways to connect this. No wonder so many of our models and theories, like, they have no chance of being connected. Like we can't. We haven't really gotten to a place where they could be really connected. So that's an aside comment. But my point that I'm getting at, constantly pushing away from, is differentiating signal and noise across these different levels is almost like this. It's a very hard thing to do, because what is noise for something that's going to emerge in a different time scale later? That's the interpretation of that is dependent on the lens of analysis you're using. Like for a certain signal, something is going to be noise, or for a certain signal, or for a certain, or not even signal, for a certain you could say behavior or proto behavior, or like the different sort of, there's these sort of different, you know, things that are only partially emerged or emergent or tangent or shaping of something, much like I think of the weather maps. I'm not trying to, I don't want to center on that analogy too much, but you have these different like features that are impacting the development of a lot of different things at a lot of different time scales, and they're always happening. You know, and I feel like that's such an interesting space to think about, and a hard space to operate within. But you know, it's a nod to maybe some of the better parts of, you know, observer aware, like second order plus 4E plus condition, but second order cybernetics where it's like, okay, there's the role of the observer, etc., and it's coming a bit more. And one other thing I want to say that's, I want to throw another card on the table here after this volley of stuff is, when you originally asked me, you know, or presented the question of why is it that we don't feel everything, you know, or we don't, why is it not everything is like affectively or cognitively available? And I thought like that particular question in of itself, which I think I really fascinated with that question because I think that question to me, at least maybe even out, maybe it's fair to say outside of the context that was brought in here today. In general, that question to me is really important because it kind of touches upon, in some of my own personal language, and I want to write something specifically about what I mean when I say this. It touches upon the sympathetic view of why things are really, really hard to do. And what I mean by that is, it's, you know, living is hard, you know, that's a very funny, easy way to say it, but like the cost of things is hard and challenging. And like, it's an amazing balancing act that we take for granted, that's literally balancing and figuratively, like it is so hard to make a system that's viable, that can like a living or functioning at all, but like an organism that can sustain in a non-emo sappy, non-ironic way, sustain the weight of living. Like it is really hard to do that. And so something that actually functions and stays alive and has this like intricate process, it's sort of like it would be horrible to like have to individually assign what my neuron, like tell my neurons to fire individually. It would be, or where to move the oxygen molecules in my blood, you know, like that would be horrific. Like your life would be miserable, you know. And obviously like dysfunctional, like to take the cognitive awareness and zoom that smart down and say, all right, blood vessel number, you know, 4,069,000 today, look, you got to go here, like that would be excuse me. So you get what I'm saying, but it's like the pressure of that too, and like like the necessary tension, like the sympathetic view of why that's hard matches. Like there's a very interesting sort of light that whole view puts in the process of why the subcognitive things are what they are, and you know, really getting at, we're kind of on a bunch of things here. We come up on basal affectivity, we come up on the sort of the borderline of what that is, we come up on measuring that, we come up on these, how do you, you know, we haven't even gotten into really interesting questions about, and what would that agent, you know, the agent that Bradley described that's aware of the cognitive stuff, how would it be able to report, how would it be able to assign, and so on. And I think there's a lot of ties from that into, look, I keep referencing the brain dance stuff and this sort of magical technology that can integrate sensory experience and personal and external stuff. But also there's one other thing I wanted to say. But anyway, I've said so much, so I'm sure people have things to say. So please jump in.
Well, I think that was a really good answer to the question. So, I think that's interesting. Like, how do you assign things? Like, would you assign every molecule to be in a certain place at a certain time? So that's one of the ideas about self-organization and self-organization, self-assembly, is that, in fact, that would be too hard to do to coordinate all of that. So a lot of times you'll have these, interactions or these other things in those kind of systems where, they're self-organization is the product of interactions. Self-organization, is very self-similar in that it doesn't happen the same way every time, but those interactions kind of shape the basic structure. And then, if I had to remember that, it would be taxing. But also, if you had a developmental system, would you encode all that information in, say, genes? Or would you have genes expressed and then have, like, self-organization sort of take care of the details? So, like, for example, how much information would you need? Would you need, like, to specify everything or just the contours? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Morgan. You're going to say something? Oh, I was going to say, yeah, and there's a huge, imagine you're this would be a wonderful, I'd love to see science fiction about this. I don't know, I'm sure there is, but I don't know it. But imagine if you had to do that, if you had to be cognitively be in charge of the neurons or the blood flow to an extent, there's some particular weird thing where you have to do that, because that would be so strange, but also how untenable, how massively untenable it would be if you're I'll go caveman and say you're just walking along looking for some berries, and there's a tiger, it's coming at you. Well, I gotta move this blood vessel around. So you just kind of sit down and think, all right, you're focusing your attention on moving the blood vessel, and whoa, I really got to speed up here. You're turning your attention so internally and on such a small scale that it there's something about that. I tried to make that humorous, and I'm not really articulating, but there's also this massive behavioral higher level weight to do that, because we are of this size, because we as in human beings are embodied in this way. There's an embodiment to it, and I'll go all the way back to something I think Bradley mentioned a little bit on Wednesday also, which is, if you're a smaller organism, maybe you do sense your neuron firing differently. You talked about certain animals that are certain neurological processes that do operate more direct, or a little bit what's the word, more connected and less abstracted from actual behaviors. But stuff like that, I think there's a really interesting way to actually explore the relevance of embodiment and so on. But yeah, it's in a shorthand way is when the real live bullets are flying in living life at the level we. And it's so funny because when I say we in this moment, I feel like it's quite it's I feel it this compulsion of saying, when I say we, I mean human beings, but it's almost in the context of what we're talking about, it's more accurate to say the symbiotic relationship that the cognitive center in my body relates to my body and all the subcognitive processes that support it, as if it's like the federation of the person, as opposed to not really me, because I know I don't control that stuff, but it's doing it. So great. Yeah, like thanks, cardiovascular system for kind of doing your thing that I don't, I'm along for the ride in that, so it's quite different. But that, and that's a little bit of a nudge to, how do we actually even accurately refer to ourselves? But anyway, I've rambled quite a bit, so I don't know. I guess Morgan was just not saying anything, but kind of just being present. But I'm glad you're here too, Morgan. Um, anyone else wanted to comment on stuff? I feel like I ranted a lot. Let's see.
Well, it's great. Yeah, we should keep going on that conversation in that direction. More to come. This is the kind of thing we do in our Wednesday meetings. So if you're interested,
Yeah, we had someone like show interest in joining, but I don't know if it might not have been a good time for them. Also,
yeah, it's kind of a hard time for some people, but
yeah, it was pretty cool. Like, it's it was emceed by Gershman. And I didn't know if that was good. I don't really know that, but I recognized him. There are probably other like really cool faculty people in Harvard that I didn't really know very well and didn't know because I couldn't see their faces. But it was kind of funny because the room was really divided about like the undergraduates who came in for the food and then the people who came in because they wanted to listen to the talk. It was a pretty big divide, but it was an interesting talk, and they hold them regularly. So I'm gonna try to go to them, and as long as I'm in this area, it's like I'm gonna try to show up to that. I don't have any. Well, actually, I'm gonna see if I can. As I'm talking, I'm gonna try to put one image into the Notion so I can share it, because there's one like cool summary image that got to it, but I don't know if it's gonna work. But
okay.
basically, the theme was compositionality and culture, basically. But not. It was very much a psychology discussion. It was the main method was a rat maze, and something about changing how I can't remember the details. I'm trying to find a way to show this. Here we go. Yes. Okay. I'm gonna put this in the Notion.
All right.
Cumulative culture was compositionality and cumulative culture by Charlie Wu. He's a University of Tübingen, is where he's from. But he did stuff at Harvard, so that's why he came back there to do it. It was a very nice talk, but it was really heartwarming. And I know this is maybe a little, and I'm putting some stuff in Notion as I said this. To kind of step back from it, it's really heartwarming, and I feel like I don't know if I'm going to stay in Boston forever. But I'm so lucky to have been here, because what it really proved to me beyond all doubt, like the academic grunt work that's basically our lab, like is every lab. All the labs, all of the work is the same. Like it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter if you're at Harvard or MIT or the state school I went to for undergraduate or other places. Like it's people doing the same thing, and it's really, to see it in person has been really great. And I think for people who are more versus, older people in academia and research, it's kind of forcibly obvious, but I'm still kind of new enough to it where it's been really interesting. Like I was more involved like a couple of years ago in like the MIT reading group for like AI ethics related stuff, I guess. And I don't do as much of them anymore. But going to the Harvard talk and seeing someone, seeing someone give their talk that they would at a conference, but also seeing a little bit more of an in-house version of it that they're saying, in their community with people they know and how they talk about it there and what, the nature of talking about their work and how it's built up and how they communicate ideas. Again, it's the same thing everywhere. In there's different qualities, different rigor, different approaches and different schools of thought. But like it's really to kind of see it with your own eyes has been really. I wish I could really instill that. Like if in a mentoring capacity, I feel like letting people see and feel that is everything. And as a throwback, like it kind of wasn't until I got an opportunity at Princeton Vision that I really got to see that, because there's kind of certain barriers and certain approaches that just you don't get certain, or at least you think you don't get, but then you realize it is quite similar across the board, and you see the people who want to do the work and understanding what the work of the research is, and like the struggle of trying to communicate ideas and how hard it is to push stuff, how hard it is to develop a theory and tie it and push it forward. How it is, and it's sort of like, and it like for anyone who is familiar with any craft, like if you're someone who paints, or if you do guitar work, or if you're a chef, you kind of get the familiarity the more you do it. It's like the difference between listening to it versus playing it yourself, and then you get more sympathy that way. I just feel like that's I think it's sort of like a public good and a not science communication, but like enabling science, enabling research, saying you give a seat at the table. I feel like that whatever that is very important to me. So I always try to comment on it when I come across it, because it's something we don't really talk about sometimes, but I think it's great to normalize talking about that process of it's there, and just because you didn't have this experience, it doesn't mean it's a radically different thing that's inaccessible to other people. So going to the actual talk, and I'm going to try to put one more image in Notion. The punchline of the talk, and then I won't talk about it too much forever, is there's the conclusion, to jump all the way to the end of the talk. I think it's Wu, right? Charlie Wu?
Yeah.
Wu basically he made the comparison at the end of his talk, saying what he's trying to build towards is sort of a reference, like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development for learning, which is sort of this sort of, it's related to the idea of, you don't want to give someone something really hard. You kind of have to find the range of, where they're at, and then give them a little bit, something graspable, and finding out what that zone is relative to what they know. And that's related to Vygotsky is very big in like developmental psychology and like child and learning psychology that way. I'm not that familiar with it. But what the concluding point that he made was, the conclusion that he was getting at the very end of his talk was, that was not the center of the talk, but at the very end of the talk, he basically mentioned, gestures towards a compositional theory of cultural evolution. He's referencing Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, what a learner can do with assistance, and basically saying, you know, there's your current ability is sort of at the center of a three-layered sphere, you know, a diagram. Your zone of proximal development is like right outside of your current ability, and then the inability or things you can't do is like way outside. So you kind of got to find the sweet spot between things you totally can't do and things you're able to do. He's juxtaposing that to his own something he's developing is called the zone of recombination. What a learner can do with the primitives in their cultural concept library. The contents of a cultural concept library constrain both the total variability within a generation, like an evolutionary generation, or a cultural generation, but also the types of variability that are possible. He said one of his long-term goals is use program induction as a rational framework to infer the contents of a generation's concept library. That's a bunch of things, and creatively reuse to generate likely recombinations in order to predict leaps and jumps observed in cultural evolution. So I'm going to try to just copy this. I'm having a hard time copying this. But I'm going to try to I'll put this in somewhere. But basically, the talk was really interesting because it had to do with, that's kind of his like future work statement, and a much more recent work statement, it would be, let me get this one thing here. Oh, sorry. Okay, well, it's interesting. It's basically saying, you know, as asocial compositional learning, you have this sort of stream of experience, but then from the different experiences, you eventually get to these sort of types or these primitives via replaying or being processed the experience, and then in you know this is like self individual learning, and you can recombine them. So there's like the element of combinatorial play or combinatorial reorganizing of the primitives, and there's a lot of talk earlier in the talk about you know you can kind of like on the lower end of things, you can easily mimic certain things, and like it's a low cost to just mimic, versus but lower cost and also much more easy to implement, but much less wiggle room. But at a higher level, the top down stuff, you can have a lot more combinatorial restructuring of things, and you can be a lot more customizing, but it's a little bit higher computational, or like not computational in the AI sense necessarily, but computational cost, and differentiating how like lower primates are really good at mimicking, and have a weight towards that, but not some of the symbolic manipulation of concepts that we do, and how this relates to social stuff. It's pretty socially, the famous, I forget what it's called, but the famous the experiment where it's like you take I forget which primate, but you take a chimp or a gorilla or something, and you put him in front of the box, and you do something on top, and then you do something on bottom, and then you get what's inside the box. And for human beings, because there's sort of, I always say, like, you have an observer there, the social child will be like, okay, well, I was told to do the top and the bottom, so even after you show me I don't have to do the top, I'm still going to do the top and the bottom because of that social, pressure to do that. The social, I was told to do this. But once you reveal to the gorilla or whatever that, oh, you just have to do the bottom one, then they just do the bottom one all the time. They I don't need to do that. So that kind of social pressure, and just a lot of things came from this, all this into taking compositional learning of primitives from the asocial individual learning, and saying how in a culturally extended concept library, there's sort of individual experiences may vary, but there's sort of these sort of primitives that emerge, and then like almost like it is the word affordances, but it's almost like the affordances of the culture and the primitives that are available can combine in new ways. And he kind of basically comparing that to, you know, the conclusion was a bit like the future work is a bit like taking zone of proximal development in the Vygotzkian sense and saying zone of recombination in terms of what a culture or a group of things has, and the sort of primitives that are accessible, and then what can come from them in the space of how they can be recombined in sort of the culture as is, or the culture that is becoming. So I will leave it at that. Probably not the most coherent, but I couldn't get the images, so I apologize. That's just my voice for this. But, it's interesting.
Yeah, I put some notes in the Notion where I was like summarizing what you had said. Some of the key points. So yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, it sounds like they're, you know, kind of working from this idea of sort of fusing culture and cognition together, and how you could do that. And I take it he's a sort of a computational person, because I saw that he was some sort of AI, cluster of excellence machine learning at the University of Tübingen. So that's, you know, kind of a computational perspective on that.
Yeah, it was an interesting, like it was a much more psych heavy talk than I'm used to.
Yeah.
So like some of like the policy discussion, policy inference, value inference, and model based inference. There's these sort of different tiers of the things, and how like getting more familiar with what those terms meant in this sense, and like both sort of like the psychological the psychology take on them, and then the way people in that space try to prove or disprove the points, because there are a lot of the questions were from other faculty members there that were kind of trying to get at it's kind of heartening, because it's sort of like the core of the methods project that we're doing. A lot of the questions are about, okay, well, what are the assumptions that what are sort of the assumptions you're putting into how you're designing testing this thing, and like all the questions were like specifically about that in an encouraging way, and I find that to be always a nice thing when it's sort of, you know, what are you trying to get at? What's your blind spot and assumption for what you're trying to test here? And there's just another thing that I'm missing that I wanted to say, but there's some discussion about like arbitration and like resolving between the different ways of determining things. But I'll leave it at that. I think I will maybe write up something a little more coherent and sputter around this. So yeah, we can move on to other things.
All right.
I think you still want to do other papers, right?
Yeah, I'll do one more. So I wanted to bring up something from last time. I talked about non-Euclidean virtual worlds and some of the things you could do there. So they're very different from the Euclidean representations we usually use, both for like sort of game worlds where you navigate, and then like spatial navigation experiments where we're explicitly looking at how you navigate and, you know, move around the space and do that versus, say, like a control condition. So a non-Euclidean space, to recap, are these kind of spaces that aren't Euclidean. So they have weird angles or they have weird shapes. They involve, you know, different types of, you know, nesting that are not necessarily visually intuitive. So it does affect your navigation performance and so forth. So I was doing a little bit more reading on it, and I actually found out that the way that it's defined amongst the gaming community is a little bit different than the more formal definition. So the more formal definition is to just sort of say, instead of a Euclidean space, we'll build a hyperbolic space and have this sort of curvature, and it results in these sort of weird angles if we have two curvatures that meet in certain places. In gaming, they're a little bit more rough with their definition, or a little bit more general, and it's basically anything that doesn't match the real world. So there's this article, Non-Euclidean Game Worlds. This is a Non-Euclidean Worlds engine. This is a video, kind of talks about how to build these kind of places. So Code Parade, which is a organization on itch.io, is developing a hyperbolic 3D game engine where a line is not necessarily the shortest path between two places. So basically anything that doesn't reflect the sort of perspective or the sort of geometry of the real world is considered a non-Euclidean world. This is an example here where you have a doorway, and this portal is, it's Euclidean in the sense that it has perspective inside of it. But then you go and you can see that the ground behind it, the horizon is lower than the horizon on either side. And so that's, it's sort of disconcerting because you expect to go through the portal and you expect to get out on the other side and you expect to be a continuous world. And it's clearly not a continuous world.
Hey Bradley, are you trying to share your screen?
Oh, yeah. Look at that. So it's clearly not so this is the horizon here on either side of this portal. And then you can see the horizon's lower when you go through the portal. Now this could be a visual illusion. You could have a wrinkle in the space on either side of this portal. But it's disconcerting when you're trying to navigate through the world. So I was impressed by the tunnels that are longer inside than outside. So this is where if you go into the tunnel, it can be longer inside than outside. If you were just to look at it from the outside and then walk through it, it would be different. But the 3-roomed house blew my mind. Can't wait for the unsettling haunted house games to come. And so this just talks a little bit about some of the features of a non-Euclidean world. So there are a lot of possibilities here. This is a non-Euclidean rendering engine. This is the GitHub repository from the Hacker Poet account. This is where we have some tools here. This is a non-Euclidean rendering engine for Windows, written in C++ OpenGL. So this is something you can check out through this YouTube video. This just kind of gives some information about, how to implement this. So if people are interested in this. And then this is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, okay, I can. So this is Non-Euclidean Geometry and Games by XenoRogue. XenoRogue runs a YouTube channel on some of this more traditional non-Euclidean geometry rendering. So they have videos on like these hyperbolic spaces that have a constant curvature. So this is an example. A hexagon in the hyperbolic plane can have 6 right angles. So this is the hexagon here in the middle, this gray space. This is the hyperbolic plane. So it can have 6 right angles. Each corner is a right angle, instead of having the typical angles of a Euclidean hexagon. So the term non-Euclidean is often used by gamers, game development journalists, etc., to mean any kind of game where the space does not work exactly as in our world. So it's a much more expansive definition, and the non-Euclidean geometry, the constant curvature definition, is more exclusive to some of these geometries like this. While such games typically tend to be amazing and very fun, that is not what non-Euclidean traditionally means for mathematicians, or has a more precise meaning. Then they talk about a summary of what non-Euclidean means and various weird geometries used in games. So this is an article about sort of that latter definition and how we can leverage it for virtual worlds and design like that. So this talks about Euclid and some of his postulates. He was the sort of the developer of the Euclidean space. So Euclidean geometry is being what we are typically familiar with, things that have things that are aligned in say a grid, or things that have expected lengths. We're very familiar with that kind of geometry. So Euclid has shown how everything in geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, etc., could be derived from a small set of very simple postulates. But there was one thing he was not happy about, his fifth postulate, which was not actually that simple. And that is, if a line segment intersects two straight lines, forming two interior angles on the same side, that sum to less than two right angles, then the two lines, if extended infinitely, meet on that side of which the angles sum to less than two right angles. So this is, I'm not going to visualize it here, but basically this fifth postulate sort of violates the other principles that Euclid kind of laid out for Euclidean geometry. Euclid believed that his fifth postulate could be proven from the other ones, and he failed, and so did many mathematicians through the ages. The mystery had been solved in the 19th century, however. This was Janos Bollier. I am resolved to publish a work of parallels as soon as I can put it in order, complete it, and the opportunity arises. I have not yet made the discovery, but the path which I have followed is almost certain to lead me to my goal, provided this goal is possible. I do not yet have it, but I have found things so magnificent that I was astounded. It would be an eternal pity if these things were lost on you. All I can say now is I have created a new and different world out of nothing. And so this is where they were starting to come to terms with this idea of non-Euclidean geometry. So they talk about this. Gauss called this non-Euclidean geometry. Today we call this hyperbolic geometry. Well, two-dimensional non-Euclidean geometry can be hyperbolic or spherical. So there are different versions of it. A sphere is curved in the third dimension. We say it has constant positive curvature. So this is an example of a sphere, the Earth, and a coordinate system on the Earth. And so this is analogous to a hyperbolic plane, this example. The surface of the Earth is a good approximation. Though the curvature is not exactly constant, it is slightly more flat on the poles, so the poles flatten out, whereas the rest of the Earth has this constant curvature. Euclidean geometry has curvature 0, while the hyperbolic geometry has a constant negative curvature. So you can have this positive or negative curvature, and with Euclidean geometry you have a curvature of 0. You can easily tell whether you're in a non-Euclidean world in the following ways. So if we know that we're in a Euclidean world sort of through our own intuition because we've learned what those look like, and it's easy to know what those look like. In a non-Euclidean world, though, we have to figure out cues for how to know we are in one. So there are a couple listed here. The first is, in Euclidean geometry, we have parallel lines which are in a constant distance from each other, so like a grid. And so they don't intersect, or they don't come closer to one another than at any point in the interval in which they're parallel. In spherical geometry, they would converge, and in hyperbolic geometry, they would diverge. So in a sphere, like on the surface of the Earth, your longitude lines sort of converge at the poles. If you were on a grid, if you had a map where you took part of the sphere and you pulled off the surface and flattened it out, you can build a map where the longitude lines are straight and parallel and never intersect or come closer to one another at any point. And then in a hyperbolic geometry, they would diverge at the poles. So it would be like something where it would be the inverse of this, actually, where at the poles the lines would diverge. So it would be kind of like something like this. Okay, so look at the angles of a triangle. In Euclidean geometry, they sum up to 180 degrees. In spherical geometry, they sum up to more. For example, take the North Pole, and two vertices are the equator as vertices. In hyperbolic geometry, they sum up to less. So this is the classic idea of if you take a triangle, the angles, if you sum up the angles of the three vertices, it's 180 degrees. If you have spherical space, it's greater than 180 degrees because so I can actually show this on the board. This is a linear space where you have a triangle, and it's just these three angles here that are 60 degrees apiece. In a spherical example, the outsides of the triangle are kind of like this, so they're greater than 60 degrees. And then in a hyperbolic space, it might be something like this. So they're less than 60 degrees. So you see it's the same shape, it's just being warped in different ways. An easy way to tell whether a game uses truly non-Euclidean geometry is to look for rectangles. In non-Euclidean geometry, there are no rectangles. Anything that looks a bit like a rectangle actually has angles smaller than 90 degrees, or its edges are curved. So if you see rectangles, the game is probably not non-Euclidean. So again, a rectangle is the space where, like, you have something like this. And then with a non-Euclidean rectangle, it's something like this. So that the edges diverge from one another towards the end. So these two edges diverge from one another in their width, and so do these two edges. So they diverge towards the end of the object. In Euclidean geometry, a circle of radius r has a perimeter 2 pi r, as we expect. In spherical geometry, it is 2 pi sine r, which is bounded. So it's like in spherical geometry, we have something more akin to a sphere or a sphere. And then in hyperbolic geometry, it is 2 sin hr. So this is which grows exponentially. So it's just that, when you have a different equation to calculate the radius. So the radius actually, if you plug in numbers to r, it's going to have a different sort of trend. So it's either just kind of this linear effect, this bounded effect, or this exponential function. In a three-dimensional hyperbolic world with absolute unit of 1m, a ball with a radius of 100 meters, so this is an absolute unit of 1 meter. A ball with a radius 100 meters will have a greater volume than the observable universe. So in a hyperbolic world, your circle of your radius is such that if you start with 1 meter as your basic unit or absolute unit, your radius of 100 meters will have an extremely large volume. And I say meters because m is just kind of the unit. I don't think it's necessarily meters, but give you sort of a mental picture of what that looks like. In truly non-Euclidean 3D games and simulations, the parallax works differently. In Euclidean space, things that are far away from you, stars, distant mountains, are seen in roughly the same place as you move. So you have this sort of frame of reference in the environment, and you have your movements. So this is parallax, where you have one plane where you're observing, and one plane where you're moving. And so if things are moving in this direction, and you're moving in this direction, or if you're moving in the same direction, you should be able to track things from your frame of reference to the observation. So if you're looking up at the night sky, you see stars move, and they move in a certain direction, and you're on the surface of the Earth, and the Earth is moving, and so you have that's part of the whole mapping here of this parallax view. So this is something that we worry about with, I think it's like that. So this is something we worry about with different reference frames. So we have a sort of an egocentric reference frame that we're in, or wherever we are, we're on the surface of the planet, or we're walking away from something or towards something, and then those objects move, and they may move in the same direction or different directions, but that's the visual effect. So in Euclidean space, things that are far away from you, stars, distant mountains, are seen in roughly the same place as you move. This changes in non-Euclidean geometries. In hyperbolic space, everything moves, while other non-Euclidean geometries are even weirder. And this is a link to something that is another example. So they say play our Hyper Rogue to explore non-Euclidean worlds. So they have this Hyper Rogue game that they've designed here. So this is the game here. This is I guess you can do this on a mobile device or your PC, and you can play this game where they have these non-Euclidean spaces, and so you can explore some of these hyperbolic geometries. They talk about manifolds. There are some games like T for God, where the VR world you're exploring is huge, while the real world you are just walking back and forth around a small room. So there are these different things where the dimensions of the virtual world and the physical world that you're interacting in are much different. And so when the distance is not the Euclidean metric, I've seen some people argue that any games played on square grids are non-Euclidean. This is because in such a game, the number of steps you need to take to reach point xy from point 0, 0 is given by the formula absolute value of x plus absolute value of y, called the taxi cab metric, because there's this idea of the Manhattan distance, which is the distance on a grid, on a grid, and of course taxis follow the grid in Manhattan, and then so that's how they measure distance in Manhattan, taxi cab drivers, and that's why they do that. Or max absolute x absolute y, called the Chebyshev metric, or some other formula where the set of points in d steps is an octagon. Well, the Pythagorean theorem says that the distance between 2 points is actually the square root of x plus y. This is the Euclidean metric. So this is where basically you're operating on a grid. That grid has, you can take a distance to any point on the grid, and you can measure. So like, for example, we have a grid here. I can take a distance to from any one of these points to any other point. And that distance can be like this, or it can be like this. So the Euclidean distance is actually this side of the triangle. And you can actually go like down one street and up one street, or you can measure this diagonally. And that's how we think of distance in a grid or in a Euclidean geometry. So actually, that's not useful in a non-Euclidean space. So this is why, we want to kind of have different rules for this, and why this is so sort of unintuitive to us in the way we think. So there are a bunch of artists associated with non-Euclidean geometry. One of the most famous is M.C. Escher. If you've ever seen an Escher painting, especially the ascending and descending stairs, where he has, like, you start off on one landing of a set of stairs, you walk up the stairs, and then you get to the you go in like a circle or a square, and you get to the original landing where you started, and it seems like you've been walking up the stairs, but in fact, you have not been walking up the stairs, you've just been walking around the circle. So you end up at the same place. So it's really like disconcerting when that happens. But it's really a matter of like M.C. Escher exploiting the aspects of non-Euclidean geometry. And so he did use non-Euclidean geometry in his circle limit series. However, if a game reminds you, e.g. ascending and descending waterfall, relativity, depth, or another world 2, those are all paintings by M.C. Escher. These artworks do not have much in common with non-Euclidean geometry. Commonly used terms for such spaces include impossible space, geometry, or Escher-esque. Okay, so Another person is H.P. Lovecraft, and so they described a lot of non-Euclidean spaces. The descriptions were quite vague, but again, it's something that is not necessarily something you can conjure up in your head. But in Lovecraft's world, non-Euclidean had a non-mathematical meaning. The angles look mostly normal, and but they're just things to think about, like in fiction, and maybe we can apply them to other things. So there are a bunch of games using non-Euclidean geometry. There's Hyperrogue, Hyperbolica, which I talked about last time, Ringris, which is like Tetris, but it's non-Euclidean, Magic Tile, which is like Rubik's Cube, but it's non-Euclidean on two-dimensional manifolds, Hyperbolic Maze, Hypernom, Hyperbolic Games, Work Minds, and there are a couple more. There's the Holonomy Maze, which is based on the concept of holonomy in spherical geometry. This is a 3D printed puzzle based on non-Euclidean geometry and topology that was developed by Henry Seegerman. And then there's some interactive demos using non-Euclidean geometry that, if you're interested, you can follow up on. They're largely hosted on GitHub and other places. So these are all things you can check out. Non-Euclidean games in development, which are not out yet, and then games in wrap spaces. So actually, the games in wrap spaces are sometimes called non-Euclidean, even though it is one of the oldest tricks in game design. So there are all these examples of games that exist on a toroid or on a torus, and it's like if you're on a flat screen with edges, the action will move off the screen because things are moving around the space. Like in asteroids, for example, the asteroid moves off the screen, and then does it disappear? Does it go away? Well, it actually turns out that the whole game is represented on a torus. And so that's just like a donut, but it's a flat donut. So when you go off the side of the screen, you actually come around to the other side of the screen. And so the whole thing is continuous with respect to space, but it's not discontinuous with respect to your perspective. Because it's disappearing, it's actually going around the torus and coming back out into the field of view. So if you think about like a toroidal game, your field of view is here, and your gameplay is in here. You have these objects, these asteroids, and you're here, and you're trying to shoot them, and one moves off the side of the screen, and you expect it to disappear, but it comes back here, or it comes back here. And the reason it comes back here is because you're actually on a larger toroidal grid, which is here. And everything is referenced in terms of that toroidal grid. So it moves off and it moves around the back of the grid, and it comes around the front, and eventually comes back into the field of view. So things are continuous, but they're discontinuous to the observer. Pac-Man does the same thing. There's this edge where you go off the edge and you come back around the other side of the edge. In Pac-Man, they use a cylinder or manifold with a boundary. In asteroids, they actually use a flat torus, but it's the same principle. Civilization does this manifold garden and tetrasphere. They also have portals, which we've talked about before in virtual worlds, but the portals actually take you to another part of the world. So if you're in a you go through a portal, it's like a discontinuous jump into another part of the world, but you can map those using this non-Euclidean geometry to go to another place. And then there are games of impossible spaces. So there are different spaces where directions are not consistent. You end up in different places when you make the same moves. If you create maps, the maps don't match the world correctly, and other kinds of things. And then the recursive games, which are where you have these recursive properties. Some games use constructions which contain a smaller copy of themselves or contain themselves. This has a interesting set of geometric consequences. Mathematically, it's called an affine manifold. If any affine transformations are allowed, or a similarity manifold if things can only become smaller or larger. So you have this affine similarity geometry, which is different from Euclidean geometry. It's not technically a non-Euclidean space, but it is something that you can do in a game world, and it works, I guess, in the sense that it's conceivable to us. It's not intuitive, but it's conceivable. And then, of course, relativistic games. I talked about relativistic applications in virtual worlds and games in the open source meeting several weeks ago. So you can use relativity to think about, like, the changes in space-time or representations of space-time. So there's this game, A Slower Speed of Light. There's Relative Hell, which is a multi-directional shooter in anti-de Sitter space, and a bullet hell game in de Sitter space. These are relativistic analogs of hyperbolic and spherical geometry. So yeah, there's a bunch of geometric weirdness that we can simulate in games and in VR. So I think that I'll leave that up to you to explore further. Okay. Thank you, Amanda, for attending. Any comments or questions on that? Okay. All right. So, all right. Have a good week. Thanks for attending.